this presentation is titled, "Should I Put My Rental Property in an LLC?" And there are considerations that abound, just, depending on what it is that you're trying to do. Certainly this question, if it was related to your principal residence, would have completely different considerations than that with putting your rental property in an LLC. Typically we wouldn't advise to put your principal residence in an LLC, whereas we certainly would likely advise that you should put your rental property in an LLC. So this presentation will go over the what is an LLC, why you should put your rental property in an LLC, and thirdly, how you would go about doing that. So if I can get my screen to work, we'll start with the what. So just a little historical background for you guys. You have a whole bunch of different entity types. An LLC is one of them. And you can really think of an entity as a wholly separate person. We actually have a bunch of statutes that define what a person is, and it includes various entity types like an LLC. So when you form an LLC, what you're doing is you're creating a separate thing in the eyes of the law. And in terms of the historical context, previously, like around the 1970s, really we had two main entity types. We had corporations and we had partnerships. And corporations were great because you had this liability protection in a corporation. And partnerships were great because you had all this flexibility. Corporations are more creatures of statute, where we have, for example, the Washington Business Corporations Act that provides all the rules for a corporation. And for partnerships, you have, it's a creature of contract. So what your contract provisions are going to control a lot of it. And basically, a bunch of lawyers found ways to try to do both at the same time, and it just made sense for various state legislatures to create an LLC, which combined the liability protections of a corporation with the flexibility of a partnership. And I'll get into that a little bit more later, but that's kind of the general overview. So with the rules of an LLC, this is a creature of contract, similar to that of a partnership. We're giving you that flexibility with an LLC. We do have an LLC statute, that's RCW 2515. It was recently amended in 2016. And as Andy mentioned, I'm lucky enough to work with my dad, David Tingstad. He's on the Partnership Law Committee for the state of Washington, and he helped revise the Washington LLC Act back in 2016. So we're up to date on all of the current law, trying to be on the cutting edge of all this stuff. And while there is a statute, you can change things. While it may work one way under the statute, if you have an LLC agreement, you can control what you want to happen in certain situations. This is why it provides that flexibility for you. You're not beholden to the statute like you would be in a corporation. You can creatively draft an LLC agreement to get a result that you want. Now, that said, there are certain things that you can't waive in an LLC agreement, meaning you can't get around the statute in certain aspects, but they're fairly limited, and frankly, they all make a good deal of sense. Now, moving to the players of an LLC, you really have three kinds. You have members, and people kind of draw similarities to a member with that of a shareholder or a partner. That's not really the way that it works. Members have membership rights under the LLC agreement. When you think of shareholders, you hold stock or whatnot. Instead, you're holding an interest, a membership interest in the LLC. Now, a manager is, like it says on the screen, not a director or an officer like you may see in a corporation. Instead, they're a manager for purposes of the LLC. They don't necessarily, they're not like a manager of a restaurant, you might say. They're the manager of the company. So they get to make a host of decisions that are described in the LLC agreement. Sometimes members get to vote on what's going to be decided. Other times managers get to do things, whether it be unilaterally or with some vote of the members as well. And, you can be both a member and a manager. You can only be a member. You can only be a manager. All of those are considerations that depend on your specific facts at play. And the third thing in here is transferees and economic interest holders, more or less. And with these, I'll move to the next slide. There's kind of a difference. I mentioned, membership rights or management rights, but there's also economic rights. So for example, you could be a member in an LLC, meaning you have all these rights to vote on certain things or whatnot, but there's a separate economic right that may or not be included in that membership right. So we can parse these things out where you just have the right to vote on things, but you don't have the right to distributions, for example, or you can put those two things together. Oftentimes what people do in the context of a transferee or an economic interest holder is you say, okay, maybe I want an investor to come in and, help me be able to buy this rental property, but I don't want them to tell me what I have to do with this property. So I'm not going to give them any membership rights or management rights. Instead, I'm just going to give them economic rights, meaning if the rental property is making a bunch of money, they can have a right to getting a distribution from that, but they're not going to have a vote in, what I'm going to do with my property or what I'm going to do with my company. And so putting these together, you typically have membership rights, which include the right to vote, and then also economic rights where you get a distribution. You also see this a lot, if you go into like estate planning, for example, people will give their kids economic rights in their LLC, for example. They don't want to give them membership quite yet because maybe they're too young or you don't trust them or whatever it is, but you don't want to give them the benefit of the economic rights. And I'll get into a little bit of that more when I get into the why. Now, in terms of structuring an LLC, two main forms. There's member managed, and this is where you don't have a manager. Instead, the members are the ones that manage the company. So basically, anything that the company does is going to be subject to a vote of the members. And this can be, a single member LLC where there's only one person. You can have a whole bunch of members and they all have a say. At the end of the day, for member managed, the members are the one making all the decisions. For manager managed, that decision-making authority is vested in the manager and not so much the member. Like I mentioned earlier, the LLC agreement can specify when the manager is the one making the decision and when a vote of the members might be required. This is akin to like a board of directors in a corporation. They can do certain things without the vote of the shareholders or the members, but some things do require those votes. And what the statute provides that if you don't specify otherwise in your LLC agreement, your LLC is going to be manager managed, is just the general rule. Now, moving to the big question, well, why should I put my rental property in an LLC? And we're going to go over the pros and cons of doing so. And to my way of thinking, there are far more pros than there are cons. Beginning with the pros, first and foremost, an LLC, a limited liability company, provides liability protection. Like I mentioned, at the onset of this is akin to the liability protection that you would get in a corporation. And this is a limitation on liability where essentially the LLC stands in the way of your personal liability. I'll give you an example. Let's say that you own a rental property and you own it in an LLC. And the tenant slips and falls or something, some defect in the property, and they hurt themselves, and there's a $100,000 judgment that's entered, and it's entered against the LLC. Well, if let's say you had a mortgage, and the mortgage was basically the equivalent value of the property itself, Well, all you would have to do is, that you get this judgment entered. Well, the company effectively has no money. The property value and the mortgage basically wipes all that out. There's no money left over for the tenant to go after. And they couldn't pierce through the company to then get to you. Instead, you would be protected. And there's certain things that you have to do in order to get this liability protection. Like, for example, you can't commingle your personal funds with the entities. It's important to have an organized accounting system where you're not just taking the company card and swiping it as though it's your money, for example. All of the company expenses should be borne by the company out of the company's accounts. All of the revenue from the company should first be put into the company before you give a disbursement to yourself. And also with liability protection, you can't intentionally break the law, for example. Like, if you walked into your tenants, into the premises and punched the tenant in the face, well, you wouldn't have that same liability shield that you had in the previous example of the slip and fall. So far and away, probably the biggest benefit is this liability protection. And while you could get that in a corporation, all of the other benefits of an LLC far outweigh the liability protection of that of a corporation. And just on a personal note, you should really never put real property in a C Corp for tax purposes, amongst others, but just kind of a general rule. In terms of the other benefits, certainly you get to own property with a partner, akin to a partnership. Maybe some people want to be investors, others want to be active participants in the management of the company, and that opens up a range of doors to be able to acquire more different properties. Maybe if you have investors, you're able to get an apartment complex or something like that. Then there are, tax advantages associated with being an LLC, because you get to choose how your LLC is going to be taxed. You can be taxed as a partnership. You can be taxed as a corporation. You can be what's called a disregarded entity, where basically for tax purposes, it's as though everything flows through to that of the members, so you're only taxed once. For the most part, in terms of like single member LLCs, or LLCs where a marital community is the only member, it's really a distinction without a difference when you're choosing, do I want to be taxed as a disregarded entity, or do I want to be taxed as a S Corp, partnership? But that flexibility of being able to choose how you want to be taxed is really helpful. I also have in here the real estate excise tax exemption. If you currently own property, yourself, and you're going to be transferring the property to the LLC, typically when you transfer property, real estate excise tax applies, and no one likes paying that. But there are a slew of exemptions to that, and one of them is the mere change in identity exemption. So if, let's say, you and your spouse own a property, and you guys want to form an LLC and dump it in there to get all of the benefits of an LLC, you would actually be exempt from having to pay the real estate excise tax on that, which is really helpful, and it kind of eliminates the barrier for wanting to transfer the property into an LLC in the first place. I touched on this next bullet point briefly, where you want to separate your business and personal finances to ensure that you get that liability protection. And of course, it's really helpful just from an organizational standpoint. When you go to, let's say, sell, whether you're selling interest in the company or selling the property itself, if you are well organized and your accounting is done properly, it can actually increase the value of the LLC, because we know what we're getting ourselves into if we're going to buy it. And then just on a kind of a simple level, when you own property as an LLC, there's a bit of professionalism that goes into it. Oh, I'm a tenant dealing with an entity, a business, for example. Sometimes people view that as, oh, these people know what they're doing. They have their wits about them. And that's not always the case, but it can kind of give that allure of professionalism. Moreover, you have an organization and a plan to it. If you have one property in LLC, I mean, you can kind of do this organizational chart of all the different properties you have owned by these LLCs, managed in certain ways, where you have this structure and certainty as to, okay, if this happens, then this happens. And this is where like an LLC agreement becomes incredibly helpful, because if done right, we can point ourselves to say, oh, okay, we planned for this situation. So in the event that X happened, I know that Y is going to happen next. And so just being organized and having a plan can be really helpful. Another of the lesser kind of known benefits of an LLC, or at least it's not talked about as much, is this idea of anonymity. People don't know who is all part of an LLC. And, if you don't want to be putting your name out into the world for the slew of different tenants that you may have, the LLC acts as a barrier for that. They deal with the LLC as a person instead of you personally, which can be helpful. And the last benefit that I have in here, and this is a non-exhaustive list, is estate planning, this planned gifting. I talked about it briefly earlier, talking about economic interests. So when you own a rental property in LLC, it's going to, hopefully produce income with the rent. And over time, maybe there will be equity in the property. Well, the older that you get, maybe you want to pass it to, your kids or friends or some sort. And if you waited until the very end, like when you passed, then there would be a large tax bill due. But if you structure it right, what you can do is gift a certain percentage of the LLC, whether it's membership or economic interests, to whoever it is you want to gift every year, so that over the course of time, all of it will be transferred prior to your death, or a portion of it. And when you do that, there is no tax on that gift. I believe the current amount for that is about $12,500 of value in a gift. So if, to use round figures, if you had a property at 100 grand, you could gift 12.5% of your company every year. And you can do that for multiple people, right? So if you had 3 kids, you could give that, $12,500 value gift to each of them, tax-free, so that when you did pass, whatever is left over, that might be handled with the whole estate tax, but none of the rest of it will. So there's an added benefit of this planned gifting. And again, it goes back to having a plan at the onset, knowing what you want to do, so that you can have some certainty moving forward. I already talked a bit about the tax side of things. This is just kind of a general summary of it. Feel free, with this recording, if you want to go back and take a look at it. This is just kind of a general overview of what I've already discussed. So with the LLC, there's also this idea of transferability and flexibility. So you're not beholden to what you decide at the beginning of your LLC. If at the beginning it's just, let's say, 2 spouses, it doesn't always have to be that way. You can add more members, you can transfer economic interests, you can get investors to come in. It's this ever-evolving thing, being an LLC, where you can create it to be what you want it to be. And this is why an LLC is incredibly helpful, because it's a creature of contract. And some of the drafting considerations I have in here with LLC agreements, because again, it's the contract that we're going to be looking at. In the event of certain things, well, how do we know what happens? So there are certain events, let's say, that happen: death, disability, resignation, divorce, these sorts of things. The LLC agreement can specify what is going to happen. It will trigger a consequence, whether it be a buyout, a forfeiture, a transfer. Maybe there's going to be, you know, something else that you want to have happen. And you can create that in your LLC agreement with some foresight. And when people disagree, like let's say you have two members or two managers or what have you, and they disagree, it's absolutely critical that you have a procedure for resolving these differences. These are called deadlock resolution procedures. Because if there is a deadlock and the LLC can't break it, meaning there's no procedure to get out of it, it's essentially at a standstill. And this allows what's called judicial dissolution of an LLC under RCW 2515-274, where a court can say, hey, this isn't working. You guys can't make decisions together anymore. We're going to end this thing and sell it. And you might not want that. Maybe you do, but if you plan ahead and have a deadlock resolution procedure, that won't happen. And again, I have planned gifting in there, as I discussed. And another one of the benefits is that when you do pass, the LLC interest, your membership interest in the LLC, is a non-probate asset. Whereas if you owned it individually, the property itself would be a probate asset. And that comes with a bunch of differences in terms of taxation. If it's a non-probate asset, you can transfer it outside of probate without the tax implications. Whereas if you're in probate, we got to deal with all of those taxes associated with the probate and the expensive procedure, bringing lawyers in to start a probate, these sorts of things. Getting into the cons, the cost of it, it isn't exceedingly high of a cost to start an LLC, but it is certainly something to think about. And and I think one of the next couple slides, I'll give an overview of what those costs are, what you guys can expect. But basically, you have startup costs, and this would be, okay, I got to go to the Secretary of State, and you click through, there's a LLC formation or an entity formation link that you click and work through, and then you pay a fee for that. The Secretary of State will then give you a certificate of formation. Okay, now this LLC is a formed entity, but there are other costs as well. For example, some municipalities require a business license for an LLC to rent property. I know here in Edmonds that's a requirement, and there's a cost associated with getting a business license. It's not cost prohibitive, but it is another cost to be wary of. Then, of course, recording. If, let's say, you own the property between you and your spouse, and you wanted to put the property into an LLC, you would have to do a deed giving the property to the LLC, and that would come with a recording cost. So those are just some of the costs associated with forming an LLC. And then there's just kind of some considerations like, okay, if I'm going to start an LLC, I need to be really intentional about what I'm going to put in that LLC agreement. It has drastic ramifications for what's going to happen here in the future. So this is really important that I understand where I'm at and where I want to go. And this is a little bit of where, my law firm chuckles, because really, like, there's a ton of online services where you can go and start an LLC with LegalZoom, and they'll give you an LLC agreement, just kind of a form boilerplate LLC agreement. People are like, well, why don't I just do that? Well, you absolutely can. It's just that they don't provide the intentional and creative drafting that, let's say, a law firm that knows you may be able to provide and plan for these things in the future. We chuckle because when people go to LegalZoom, inevitably what it does, it creates bigger disputes. And then people have to go and litigate these disputes and pay lawyers even more money. It doesn't always work out that way, but we've seen it done many, many times. I also have that insurance premiums can be higher. That's not always the case, but sometimes when insurance companies see that an LLC owns the property, they view it as like commercial insurance, and they may increase the premium a little bit. But I will say from my experience, that's pretty rare, especially because whether you and your spouse own a property yourselves versus owning it as an LLC, there's no real difference as far as the insurance company is concerned, but it can affect things. And the last thing I have on here is due on sale clause issues. With this, when you own property and then you want to give it to an LLC, what a lot of mortgages have, what the language in the mortgage is that there's a due on sale clause, meaning when the property is transferred, your whole mortgage becomes due. And when you're transferring title from your personal capacity into your LLC, that can be construed as something triggering the due on sale clause. And certainly you don't want that, and you don't want to have to deal with your mortgage company on that. But the good news is that no mortgage companies care. If you're transferring the property from yourself to your LLC, really, there's no mortgage company that's going to go, oh, that triggers the due on sale clause. Your whole mortgage is due now. So typically, you don't even have to deal with the mortgage company at all. You just transfer the property into your LLC, and then you go on your merry way. That said, there can be issues that arise, so just important to call it out, but it's exceedingly rare. Now on to the how and the costs. Like I explained earlier, you start with the Secretary of State. There's a $180 fee to form it. Online, an extra $20. If you want to expedite it, it's another $100. And then once you form it, this will be a recurring charge. Every year, you have to do what's called an annual report, basically telling the state, oh, hey, this LLC is still up and running, it's still going, and you pay a $70 fee associated with that. Then you have the business license with the Department of Revenue, and that's $50. An additional $5 cost for trade names if you want to use them. There can also be additional business license costs for municipalities. I have on here that Edmonds is $125 for a general business license, Redmond $153, and so there are these costs to consider. But when you factor in all of the benefits that you're getting with an LLC, it really does. The pros really do outweigh the cons over time, and giving yourself that peace of mind with that liability protection, with that flexibility, with the tax benefits can really be helpful. And I also put on here the recording fees. It is rather expensive to record a document for some reason, $303.50 plus an extra $1 for each additional page to record a deed. So just the costs to consider. And so that's really the what, the why, and the how about LLCs and why you should put your rental property in an LLC. And so if you guys have any questions about any of this, this is my contact information. That QR code also links to my online business card. Feel free to reach out to me or anybody at my firm. We deal with this stuff a lot, not just LLCs and rental properties, but a whole host of business and real estate things. So really appreciate you guys taking the time, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.